Today is Friday, May 28th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor, this is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and we are entirely listener-supported, so if you like what we do and you want to help us grow, you can help us in a number of ways. Of course, you can subscribe to our Patreon, where we post all of our shows, and perhaps someday we will have some bonus content for you. Short of a monetary donation, you can always share these episodes with your friends and family, or leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or on Audible. You can also follow us on Twitter, you can like our Facebook page, and you can even join the conversation on our Reddit or Discord. Questions, comments, concerns, vitriol, send those to noeasyanswerspodcast@gmail.com, and all of those links are available in the show notes, and we appreciate all of our listeners who keep this show going and all of our subscribers on Patreon. So, before we get started, I want to say that I know it has been about 5 weeks since our last show, and what can I say? On the one hand, we're all coming out of a long, dark winter, and it's pretty much summer now, and so parts of normalcy have been returning, and with all that, I went and got a job as a sound engineer at a local club in Woodstock. I live near Woodstock, New York, so I haven't had quite as much time to commit to the podcast as I did during the winter. But I don't want to sound like that's an excuse, because it's really not an excuse. I'm just telling you like it is, but at the same time, I wanted to stand by my promise of always bringing you content that is enriching, that you will, hopefully, be able to take something from it that enhances your way of being in the world. So, I wouldn't just bring you any old bullshit. So, I read about half a dozen books and wrote about 20,000 words, and this episode is going to set the course for the arch this show is going to take for the next handful of episodes. Today is part one of what is at the moment a 4-part series, and I'll tell you more about the subsequent episodes in a bit, but first I want to tell you a little bit about how this episode took shape before we launch into the episode itself. So I live near Woodstock, New York, and Woodstock is a little town upstate that's about 2 hours north of New York City. Nestled in the Catskill Mountains, it was home to a little music festival in 1969. You might have heard of it. Though Woodstock, the town, isn't large enough to have a single traffic light, in the summer it'll take you a good 45 minutes to get to the center of town and find a place to park. Tourists come from all over the world to see the place where Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin performed. But a lot of tourists find out once they arrive in Woodstock that concert didn't take place in the town of Woodstock. No, that show was moved at the last minute to a place called Bethel Woods, about an hour away. For whatever ways the town has learned to cater to tourists, selling tie-dye t-shirts with peace signs on them, bongs with the words Woodstock 420 on them, there is an authentic hippie culture within the Woodstock community. And now I say there's an authentic hippie culture in Woodstock, but what does that even mean, right? I mean, we'd have to define hippie, and I'd probably sound like a Fox News conservative when I list the characteristics of a hippie. So I'm just going to say that thing that's in your mind that you imagine when you imagine a hippie, that person you imagine, there are quite a few of those people that live in Woodstock, New York. And you can find them on just about any afternoon hanging out on the village green. They're forming a drum circle and passing a joint. I mean, there's a guy that sometimes brings a wood flute with him, and people are dancing, singing. I mean, it's really something, or at least that's how it was before the pandemic, We're getting there. We're building it back. But, the drum circle was something that happened frequently enough at one point to where the town opted to sanction a time for it once a week, as opposed to it being just one ongoing, continuous thing. I mean, I like drum circles as much as the next person, but at some point you just get tired of there always being a person with a goddamn drum in the center of this little town just banging away. So, for all the 420 friendly, anti-war, peace and love vibes coming through this town, it totally took me by surprise to realize that the same people beating on drums and asking me for a cigarette or offering me a hit, Those were the same people who were holding anti-mask demonstrations on the Green, and they were the same people holding protests against 5G before that. Now, to be fair, I have to mention that there was a group of about half a dozen women that would dress in all black and hold protests on the village green every Saturday morning for several years, and they were protesting the injustices towards Palestinian people, so some of those protests they've gotten right. But this got me thinking about the whole town. I mean, how strange it seems that people of hippie culture would share some common ground with conservatives. I mean, it's strange to think of, a Woodstock hippie getting along with your QAnon aunt who's been living on the internet waiting for the next Q drop. But I think if their conversation revolved around a mutual distrust of the government, maybe they talked a little bit about conspiracies, and who knows, right? Maybe by the end of the conversation, your QAnon aunt will look into the eyes of your hippie friend and understand he isn't some tree-hugging liberal the media has portrayed him as. No, this hippie's making sense. He's advocating for a return to a fundamentally naturalist and biocentric way of life. And your QAnon aunt, she might have some points about how the government's interfering with your life. So here I was, imagining this scenario, and, I started writing the actual monologue and substance for this episode, but, it seemed simple enough and interesting enough, right? I mean, initially I wanted this to be about the overlaps between hippies and the New Age spiritual movement and conservative politics. And well, that's where I was wrong, and I wanted to take a moment before we enter into this conversation and tell you that I was not expecting this to go where it went. But to tell you the whole story and to give you a complete picture, I had to pursue some of these leads to their end, and those ends I was not prepared for, and they got really dark. And that's got to mean something, because on this show, we've covered some heavy topics, and we've had 4 episodes just on the topic of death. We did an episode on destructive cults, and most recently, we've been attempting to examine the psychological, cognitive, and logical workings of the far right. Now, I want to be clear here and do a little bit of self-crit. Fascism is not to be debated. It is to be smashed. So perhaps I am wholly in error in attempting to search for any humanity in something as inhumane as fascism. But as Laura Jadid said in our last episode, the real point is not to have to bash any fash anymore. So things are going to get pretty dark during this episode, and this is your last warning before we enter into the episode proper. In fact, some of the things I'm going to tell you about I think are very unsettling. They are not widely known things we're going to talk about, and not to be too mealy-mouthed about all of this, I'll say that I expected to have to write about ecology and how the far right and some of the New Age spiritual movement overlaps. I expected to have to write about how they're both prone to conspiracies, and that I was okay with writing about those. That was fine. But what I did not expect is learning about something called traditionalism, that's traditionalism with a capital T, and something called esoteric Hitlerism, and how both of those things relate to geopolitics today. The other thing I wanted to say is that the way that I wrote this, there are what seems like a great deal of items I needed to touch on, but they were all seemingly, to me, sort of disconnected pieces. But of course, if you take them all together, there is an overarching narrative that I'm quilting or attempting to quilt together, and all of them add up to a bigger picture that I'm painting. So I hope listeners will be understanding, because I'm sure at a couple of points you will ask yourself, what does this have to do with anything? So I want to ask you, the listener, amazing and beautiful person that you are taking the time to listen to this, to sit with this episode like you would sit with a film. You know how you start a film and you just have to trust the ride that you're going on? Well, I would like for you to listen to this episode much in the same way. This episode is going to set the table for the next 3 interviews I'll be releasing. So with this episode, I'm releasing an interview with Professor Benjamin Teitelbaum, where we talk about his book called War for Eternity, and why that episode follows this one will make more sense to you towards the end of this episode. Then I'll be releasing an interview with Professor Richard Polt, and we'll be talking about his book called Time and Trauma, Thinking Through Heidegger in the 30s. And then I'll be talking with my comrade Matthew Lowry from the Acid Horizon podcast about Carl Schmitt. So I think you can tell we're doing a deep dive into a couple of German philosophers, not all of them redeemable. But I think it's necessary to examine some key thinkers in order to bring to bear a greater understanding of those in our society who stand against progress. So here's where the episode really starts. So here's the thing. I would call myself an apostate, but if I'm being honest, I should tell you that I never believed. I certainly do feel like an apostate, though, having renounced my faith in the existence of a God, and with that, I'm sure my family felt I had disrespected Christ himself, and perhaps undermined the very foundations of a good Christian raising my parents attempted to provide me with in doing so. There was immense pressure from both sides of my family, with my mother instilling the Catholic Church, and later, after she divorced him, my father found Jesus in the Protestant Church. So much of my childhood was spent not wanting to sing hymns or attend Mass, not wanting to feel my grandmother pinch my ribs when I fell asleep in the pew, what the priests and the communions couldn't accomplish, making me fear hell and damnation, guilt for my sins and my thoughts and actions, and the need for repentance and salvation. The Baptist fire and brimstone sermons did, with the help of my father's imposing presence. During our weekend visitations, he would insist we spend time reading the Bible aloud, discussing what we read, and I only replied during these occasions with things he might be pleased that I replied, because disagreeing with him was generally not advised, but on the topic of Jesus and the Bible, the prospect of that did not even enter my mind. So at the height of this newfound fervor for Christianity, no doubt the result of being coerced into being baptized and saved, I had a bit of a breakdown. I was in 8th grade at the time, and I just lost it one day at school. I began to sob uncontrollably, and thankfully a teacher pulled me aside, and, this didn't happen in front of my peers. But it was something that, looking back on now, I can recognize and liken that experience to whatever the opposite of laying down your burdens at the altar is. You know what I'm talking about. That thing people do towards the end of a Protestant sermon, when the pastor invites people to come up to the front and kneel and pray at the altar. What I did was the opposite of that, meaning I could not last a second longer pretending to have faith. But I knew what I felt had deeper implications. It was not so much that I doubted Jesus or the Bible, but it came as quite a shock for me to understand about myself that I was immovably incredulous towards the existence of any God at all. I am simply unable to believe in anything spiritual. I'm an atheist, and that means no matter how many sunrises I witness or how many moonlit evenings overlooking the ocean I take in, the many splendors of this world have never made it easier to believe in an almighty creator. This is incongruent with the ways of my family, to say the least, and in many ways it has left me feeling like an outcast, both within the immediate connections of my relatives and more broadly in how I relate to others in the world. I most certainly blame myself for my inability to believe, ascribing this failure to a fundamental part of me being broken, and with that brokenness setting me separate and apart from those who were whole and capable of faith. This is why I say I feel like an apostate, in that my renouncing of a creator has also created a divide, not just in the way the believers in my family hold steadfast to their belief that I will eventually find God, but among those who claim to be atheists as well. Of the atheists I have known, Only a handful of them adhere to the full weight of the term. Most of them, when asked, will tell you their reasons for not believing in deities. But if you press them further, you will, or at least in my experiences, find they still harbor certain notions common to theists. For instance, certain atheists will tell you despite their non-belief, they still believe in a soul. Some of them may not explicitly say that, but instead refer to an interconnectedness shared by all humans. And yet others may express their openness to the possibility of reincarnation. In my mind, these items are outside the realm of atheism, and more in the domain of those who would consider themselves agnostic or spiritual but not religious. I would be lying if I said I didn't experience a certain type of familiar disappointment with atheists I have grown closest to when discovering these tendencies. Like the character Maurice Bendrix in the Graham Greene novel The End of the Affair. When he discovers his lover made a promise to God not to see him again should he allow him to live again, I too feel a certain sting of betrayal around coming to know my incredulous comrades aren't quite so incapable of belief. When an atheist tells me they're practicing mindfulness, or meditation, or even engaging in an activity as innocuous as yoga, I am suspicious as to their inner workings of their mind as it relates to their purported lack of faith. Part of me feels that it's a slippery slope, leading to a vague sense of spiritualism, and that is all that is needed to disqualify one as an atheist within the strictest sense of the term. I suppose it is possible to practice forms of spirituality while also not believing there is a God, if you're willing to suffer the contradictions therein. But I spend a lot of time ruminating on the consistency of my worldviews. It is for this reason, to me, atheism has taken on a broader meaning, not just referring to a lack of belief in a creator, but also containing a set of beliefs or non-beliefs on the supernatural. I do not believe in ghosts, miracles, mysticism, or for that matter, anything remotely transcendental. There are too many slippery slopes towards a vague sense of spiritualism. For if one believes in ghosts, this logically lends credulity towards the existence of a soul. Miracles lend credulity towards divine acts and naturally towards the existence of a creator. Mysticism encourages non-naturalist explanations and is tantamount to the positing of esoteric notions. And transcendentalism gives a primacy to the immaterial, necessarily displacing the primacy of human phenomenology. Though I am a person who distances himself from all these elements, I'm not without sympathy for those who drift from non-belief into forms of theism. Though spirituality doesn't appear on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, maybe it would appear in the self-actualization part of things, but that's a different topic for a different essay. Purely as an observable compulsion, though, human beings do have a natural urge to commune with the absolute. Though I might be bereft of this yearning, it is obvious to me that other people experience this impulse and pursue it to varying degrees throughout their life. But isn't turning away from superstition and the championing of science and reason a central tenet to the Enlightenment? Is this not the reason Immanuel Kant, though he lived a vigorous Christian lifestyle with extraordinary piety, conducted his philosophy as a rationalist? Is this not the reason Nietzsche declared God is dead in 1884, signaling the beginning of a century of ideology? Is the logical conclusion of these ends the way our Western society now exists, without commentary on spirituality and no emphasis on collective spiritual life? Perhaps it was the combination of mankind's natural compulsions to worship and society's movement away from religion that has created now what seems to be a sort of spiritual deficiency and a latent thirst for spirituality. Of course, the Marxist in me wishes to posit this as nothing more than a deep yearning for a cure for alienation, individuation, atomization, and a desire for community. But these days, it seems that everyone's a Buddhist, a Taoist, a Stoic. Those Eastern practices may not be decreed as a religion. Buddhists will often be the first to inform you that Buddhism is not a religion. But they form the core of most belief systems of those who assert that they are, quote, spiritual but not religious. Ironically, atheists seem susceptible to some of these practices, and in addition to defending Buddhism under the guise of it not being a religion, they're also quick to inform you that Buddha himself was an atheist. Nonetheless, Western society is amid what some may call a spiritual crisis, and not that there is a resurgence of religiosity in North America, as much as it is what I can only articulate as a withering of the human core under late-stage capitalism. That which makes us human cannot be communed with via consumerism. The ability to choose one product over another in an endless series of choices does not equate to actual freedom. The techno-utopia imagined during the 1990s has given way to a massive dystopian surveillance system, and the Fukuyama Declaration of the End of History seems premature to say the least, as we have witnessed the premier liberal democracy of the United States give way to forms of overt fascism. Whether the collective yearning of society is for something overtly spiritual or simply something more meaningful than commerce is debatable. But central to the ideas I wish to posit in this discourse is that the yearning and the thirst for something more is real, and ultimately, that thirst can be harmful to society because it leaves us wide open, susceptible and vulnerable to the traces of fascism we interact with every day, and we don't even notice. I remember the first time I read Walden by Henry David Thoreau. I had already renounced my faith in a creator at that point, and my thoughts on atheism had not progressed past an all-consuming resentment towards Christianity. While my critiques of organized religion were juvenile, this was the first time I had encountered an alternative notion of spirituality. How wonderful and harmonious the idea of an oversoul was to me then, as it seemed to restore the best parts of religious faith I had abandoned. The ideas of interconnectedness, the notions of an eternal essence at our core that is immortal, and our relationship to nature, all of it seemed to contain enough materialism to comport with my evolving brand of atheism while allowing me to enjoy some of the more comforting notions usually reserved for theists. Having a certain youthful impressionability, the ideas of Thoreau to live deliberately helped chart my path into adulthood. Coming out of my senior year of high school, with the world and its possibilities seemingly laid forth for my perusal, I chose to adhere to the spirit of Thoreau by engaging in what appeared to my young self to be an absolute Homeric adventure. Moving to Arizona from Texas for a brief stint at school, followed by another move to Nashville in pursuit of a career in music. Part of the inspiration for making these choices came from Thoreauvian concepts of self-sufficiency. In my mind, he had moved into a one-room shack by Walden Pond without a need for companionship, let alone other amenities offered by society. Likewise, I imagined myself like Thoreau in his selection of a shelter near the pond and my leasing of single-room studio apartments in cities far from home where I did not know a soul for thousands of miles. It was only later in life that I discovered the controversies over Thoreau's laundry that would contradict the independence he wrote about so eloquently. More insidious than his mother occasionally doing his laundry was the realization that Thoreau was a profoundly Christian writer, despite his expressions of irreverence for the church and indebtedness his writings owe to Eastern philosophical ideas. And perhaps the most pernicious aspects of Thoreauvian notions were his opinions on taxation, when paired with his flawed notions of self-sufficiency. Is there anything more libertarian than complaining about taxation and exalting self-sufficiency while having your mother clean your underwear? I suppose it was once my political and philosophical outlooks matured that I began to take notice of the ways Thoreau's independence and Ayn Rand's objectivism overlapped. That they shared a common belief towards individualism, self-sufficiency, and one must think they would find common ground on the concepts of taxation. I think arriving at these realizations was the original slippery slope I had discerned. And so with it went my credulity towards an oversoul, a transcendental interconnectedness, and my belief in an eternal, immortal, irreducible self in the form of a soul. I'm not saying that reading Walden made me give up believing in a soul, but some of the criticisms around his work got me asking myself, what is the logical end of not believing in a God? Okay, so there's no heaven, no hell, no judgment, no afterlife. Not believing in a soul is what you get to at the bottom of all of that. Sometimes I receive these types of phone calls from my family. The type of phone calls that are normal at first, and for most of the conversation, nothing is out of sorts. But towards the end of these conversations, my mother or my aunt will inquire about my spiritual condition. Both are Catholic, so this isn't an attempt at saving me in the Protestant sense, but it does resemble that kind of framework. Their mother was much more invested in her Catholicism than either of them. Her home contained Catholic and Christian iconography at every turn, ceramic angels stationed in every room, the Serenity Prayer in a gold frame at the top of the staircase, a Virgin Mary tapestry that I still have today which displayed behind her bed frame. She even had holy water by the front door to bless yourself as you entered. And as the matriarch of the family, after having instilled the church into her 3 daughters, she insisted that I attend CCD and receive my first communion. Her aspirations for my participation in the church had metrics, with communion being the very least of these I was required to meet. Though I can't say exactly when, the aspirations of my mother and aunt for my participation in the church became much less structured. No longer did they ask if I had attended Mass recently, or if I'd become not completely closed to the idea of God existing. Now when I receive these phone calls, my mother simply asks me if I ever pray. The praying she's referring to isn't the kneel by your bedside type of praying. It isn't the holding on to a rosary while reciting several Our Fathers or Hail Marys. This is the type of praying my grandparents did, common with the Catholic tradition. And so naturally, this was the type of praying I believe she was referring to in the past. But now, the method of praying is not even something you must say aloud. She says you can talk to God quietly. You can talk to God in your thoughts. It doesn't have to be a big deal. I have a few hypotheses on why this is. At first, I thought the expectations of my mother and aunt had been lowered either by them deliberately or by the attrition of years gone by without me having made any progress back towards the church. Perhaps they had partially come to their senses, and with that, they had become more accepting of who I am and what I believe, or in this case, what I don't believe. I had a thought that Catholicism, in its own propensity for producing a certain laxity among its members, would likewise be elastic enough to contain this type of informal prayer. But it occurs to me, to the extent that an increasing number of people are identifying as spiritual but not religious, breaking with the religious traditions of their youth, and not falling directly into the camps of atheism or agnosticism, perhaps my mother being okay with silent thoughts qualifying as prayer was due to religion and modernity having adopted a different set of cultural practices. In the same way the Protestant vein of Christianity had split into several denominations, including that of non-denominations or secular churches more focused on social justice than worship, and in the same way the spiritual but not religious pieced together a sort of slapdash syncretism, so too my mother had compromised on her request for me to pray. No longer did she ask that I pray to Jesus, but instead she would be satisfied if I prayed to any God at all. Moreover, the God which I would direct my prayers at need not be the archetypical God one presumes most people direct their prayers at. God could be anything, from a single tree in the wilderness to a single flower blooming in the cracks of the sidewalk. Even if I wanted God to be a, quote, God of the gaps. She said it once more. God can be anything you want it to be. As she would explain to me, it did not matter to her the specificities of my belief so long as I held a belief in any God in any form. It only took 2.5 decades for the original intention of my grandmother, which was for me to make my way through the metrics and structure of the Catholic Church, to be reduced to the most basic request of me having a vague sense of spirituality and thinking some quiet thoughts in the direction of God from time to time. Sadly, as much as it would make my mother happy to know if I did forward some of my thoughts in the direction of God, or if I did take on even the most vague senses of the spiritual, this would be another one of those slippery slopes that I cannot allow. In my mind, in my heart, and in my practices, these are items I have disavowed and constructed my core identity to operate without. Not to mention, I am completely incapable of believing in any of these notions. And each time these conversations occur, though her requests would not be imposing on anyone capable of having faith, and though these requests carry less weight than in years past, they nevertheless return me to this feeling of apostasy. And with that feeling, I am once again made to feel separate and apart from my immediate family members, incongruent with their practices, fundamental beliefs, and outlooks on the world. As sad as it may be, for a son to not be able to prevent his own mother's unhappiness by fulfilling a singular and consistent request made several times over the course of many years, it would make me unbearably sad if I were to acquiesce or lie to her about my lack of faith. Such an out-of-character remark would probably be seen for the lie it is anyway. One of the last times we had a conversation that went in this direction, I believe I tried to explain some of this to her, and I concluded by partially apologizing for expressing some views that might have been offensive to her beliefs. And I said, "Mom, I'm sorry if I sound like an asshole." To which she replied, "No, you don't sound like an asshole. You sound like an atheist." It's amazing to me to notice the way the United States has taken on some of the structural tenets of religion. Not that this is a new thing, as it's been happening since our country's inception, and I'm not trying to take a deep dive into American history here, so I don't want to get too granular on this topic. I believe there are numerous surface-level examples of what I'm alluding to. The monuments scattered around Washington, D.C., the sacred documents of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the mythology of the Founding Fathers, as well as the engineered mythology of Christopher Columbus, and the parallels of the death of Abraham Lincoln to the death of Christ himself. All of this, and we don't even need to make mention of the use of "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance or "under God" printed on our currency, and the concept of rights being God-given. Moreover, our economic constructs have taken on their own religious likings. The free market is treated as a vast and ethereal, almost transcendental regard in the minds of Keynesians. Economics itself, with its concepts cloaked in obscurant terminology meant to dissuade one from learning its true workings, made even more complicated by the mathematical workings of statisticians, stockbrokers and day traders and cryptocurrency investors are economic esotericists, a loosely allied group of firms and individuals bestowed with a tightly held set of secrets that allow them to manipulate and profit from the whims of the market. Case in point, have you ever asked someone if they know what a dividend is? Do you know anyone that can explain to you what it is, how it functions, and the math behind figuring out whatever profit it may yield? I'm not saying you couldn't read up on and have a good understanding of labor, monetary, and exchange value over the course of an afternoon. But I am saying that understanding and yielding profit out of stocks, dividends, and venture capitalism isn't something the common person knows a whole lot about, let alone possess enough capital to make effective investments. The closest a lot of folks get to understanding these things is when they attempt to decipher high and low risk stocks regarding their retirement funds, and usually there is a person whose job it is to guide the layman through these things. One of the things I tend to ask someone when attempting to explain a part of my ideology is if they believe that markets exist to serve people, or if people exist to serve markets. Say what you will if you must laud capitalism, but capitalism falls into the camp of people existing to serve markets. In this sense, the market is not only elevated above people in terms of its importance, but it also displaces the primacy of people being the constituting element of a citizenry, society, nation-state, economy, etc. When you examine things from this vantage point, it makes perfect sense as to why Wall Street received a bailout during the Great Recession, but Main Street didn't get a bailout at all. It makes logical sense that a profit-driven healthcare system will be preserved during a time when close to 600,000 Americans have transpired during a national health crisis spurred on by a global pandemic. It makes sense why American healthcare insurances are still tied to occupations in a gig economy. These are the logical endpoints of a profit-driven system that places a primacy on the health and well-being of markets instead of people. Keynesian economics speak to a, quote, invisible hand. which is a metaphor first introduced by Adam Smith in his work The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The invisible hand is representative of the unintended greater social benefits brought about by individuals acting in their own self-interest, and the idea of trade and market exchange automatically channeling self-interest towards socially desirable ends is a central justification for the laissez-faire economic philosophy, which is an economic system in which transactions between private groups of people are free or almost free of economic interventionism. They would tell you that the free market determines prices based on supply versus demand and product availability or scarcity, but the mysterious and all-powerful invisible hand soon loses its power to determine pricing, trade and market exchange, and price stability of a product or service when a monopoly emerges, and the owner of the monopoly channels their own self-interest into the price of a product. Indeed, economic non-interventionalists take decisive stands on the need for market regulations in these instances, but seldom do we see them take these stances on aspects of industry which do harm to the environment, claiming that non-action is what is best for business, or that any action on this front would make conducting business more difficult or less profitable. The reason I tend to ask folks about markets existing to serve people versus people existing to serve markets is that it is useful to posit one of my core beliefs. An economic system that places primacy of markets over people will never make the well-being of its citizenry its primary concern. This is the logical reason why the free market produces less of a quantity of public goods than the effective amount. Since public goods or services are consumed by every person in society, and not paid into by every member, it creates a free rider type of problem. This problem exists in addition to the central contradiction therein, that there is no profit in public goods or services and can be quite correctly seen as part of the overhead costs of a society. Of course, the capitalists do not see things the way I have framed them. They would perhaps point to the public services of law enforcement and that our municipalities seem to have no issues in providing them with funding. As it stands, if you were to compare the total budget for police in the United States to national militaries worldwide, it would easily come in at third place, behind the military budget for the People's Republic of China. What the capitalists conveniently leave out is the fact that police budgets across our cities have skyrocketed, and as we have increasingly equipped them with weaponry and gear normally reserved for our actual military, much of this funding has been siphoned from our communities. We have defunded our school systems, social services, affordable housing, youth services, and other investments in service of funding our police. Recently, the New York Police Department spent nearly $250 million just in lawsuit settlements, and studies have shown the value of nationwide police department property seizures are more than double that of the value of thefts on record. Given our current predicaments, it seems rather obvious to point out that the ease of funding law enforcement and military defense is due to the very real existential threats to the state these services mitigate. When one examines the history of American policing and how they came to be the brutal occupiers of our schools and streets, under this framework it is logical that they would have evolved out of strikebreakers in the North, the Pinkertons, and the slave patrol in the South. It is helpful to think of police as the first tangible point of contact a citizen would make with the coercive forces of the state, power to which the state would not be able to enforce without the threat of violence. In that much of their training, equipment, and personnel derive from the actual military, we can accurately view police not as a group paid to serve and protect the citizenry, but as a domestic military force serving as a repressive apparatus of the state. But so much of our legal system can be overcome by being in possession of money. White-collar criminals regularly go unpunished for their crimes that harm society writ large, while smaller offenses such as petty theft or the use of marijuana are greeted with substantial penalties. Our prison systems house inmates the majority of whom never stood trial, and were kept incarcerated not on account of their offenses, but due to the fact that they did not have the resources to make bail or hire an adequate attorney for legal defense. Moreover, it is commonly the case that poverty was the root cause of their crimes to begin with. In that poverty and economic hardships are the main reasons for most crimes, the American dollar has come to represent more than currency in our society. Within our capitalist economic structures, the almighty dollar is prized above all else. It grants you privilege, access to exclusive spaces, class elevation, legal immunity, social clout, and most of all, it reassures the security of your social status. The dollar takes on a signification of a puritanical work ethic, in that it is expected of all able-bodied persons to be willing to work hard in exchange for compensation. This is considered morally good and just in our society, and to a certain degree, possessing wealth or being successful in business endeavors is ascribed into the personhood of the possessor. Contrary to the anti-materialist stances of most religions, American Christianity has increasingly adopted the ideas of the prosperity gospel, that wealth creation is godly work and is a vehicle for biblical flourishing in God's creation. It's not an overstatement to assert that wealth creation has been viewed by Christians as a holy calling and a God-given gift, as the faithful are instructed to expect material blessings as a reward for their faithfulness. Material simplicity has now been reframed by contemporary followers of Christ to be a personal decision, and that involuntary poverty should be alleviated. Wealth, in a biblical sense, has come to represent strength, power, riches, and substance, a far cry from Jesus speaking about the camel entering the eye of the needle. There have been a great deal of moral jiu-jitsu and logical acrobatics made in attempts to reconcile capitalism and Christianity. These two elements were further brought together and conflated by the state in 1954 when the U.S. government added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. But in a sense, this has always been the duality of America, the pairing of Puritans at Plymouth Rock with the slave-trading capitalists of Jamestown. When we walk around our nation's capital, and we view the enormous statue of Abraham Lincoln, or the reflection pool leading to the obelisk of the Washington Monument, or we visit one of the many graves of the unknown soldiers buried in the hollow ground of Arlington National Cemetery, it makes sense to view these monuments as political entities mixed with a bit of religiosity. On January 6, 2021, when the Capitol building was overrun with protesters, liberals chose to describe the event as a desecration. But I don't think they understood the word desecrate has a certain overtly religious connotation. To desecrate is to deprive something of its sacred character, and that is not a purely secular way of describing the events on that day, but it did get me ruminating on the blurred lines between Christianity and American state capitalism. What is the point of the separation of church and state if the state simply becomes a church? Maybe part of the reason the Bible warns not to worship idols is the overall attrition the worshiping of idols has on the religion overall. Though the Capitol Rotunda may be a sacred place for those of us who buy into American mythology, it is still a governmental building, and it is clearly not a church. Perhaps treating something like a governmental building as sacred saps sacredness from actual religious icons. Not everything can be sacred, because if everything is sacred, then nothing is sacred. And so when we start treating non-sacred items or places as something holy, there are those religious followers who recognize the cost of this is paid for by cheapening the sacredness of the truly sacred. And like the way my mother has reduced her request to me simply having a few thoughts in the direction of God, so too have cultural practices of New Age spiritualism and the breaking of religious traditions had their attrition on the act of praying. Modernity, it seems, has had a real effect on the religiously sacred. It's re-territorialized religious rituals and moved society away from religious traditions, and it is safe to assume the condition of the sacred, rituals, and traditions will only degrade further with time. As I said at the top of this essay, I am an atheist, completely unable to take that Kierkegaardian leap of faith. And for a long time, it was difficult for me to engage with theology as part of my philosophical studies. I harbored a resentment at first for Christianity discreetly, and then later, this resentment spread to the concept of a God and finally to organized religion as a whole. I like to think that I have come around to being able to entertain biblical sentiments, if not for the sole purpose of critique, then for gaining a useful perspective into the cognitive and moral workings of the faithful. This most likely is on account of me understanding the natural compulsions felt by man that compel him to worship, as it seems this is commonplace amongst the human condition. That being said, the story of Abraham always seemed particularly outrageous to me. That a father would hear the voice of God, which commanded him to sacrifice his son, to which the father was set to oblige until the voice of God at the very last moment said, "Psych." And so Abraham did not need to sacrifice his son after all. Having proven to God his faithfulness, Abraham was then rewarded by being materially blessed with an abundance of resources, many children, and assured victory over his enemies. I'm sure there are several Christian platitudes derived from this biblical story, but beyond that, what concerns me, as it pertains to our discourse, is more interpretational. The first of two things I've gathered from this story is that humans are willing to commit atrocities in the name of God. I know this seems rather obvious, but it's worth stating in that there are parallels all through history and modernity. We could mention the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition or the ISIS suicide bombers, the way Christian missionaries traveled to remote and distant lands to spread what they perceive as the word of God to souls that require saving. All of these are low-hanging fruit examples. But what about the way our nation sees the spread of liberal democracy as a godly imperative? Are we not committing atrocities in our attempts to spread a form of Enlightenment liberal thought that has been conflated with religion? Though under divine orders to kill his son, it must have been difficult for Abraham to raise his dagger over the chest of his child, because nowhere in the story was Abraham able to distance himself from his son. Perhaps if God had told Abraham his son was an impostor, or that his son was unclean, or that his son was without a soul, or less than human, raising the knife and delivering a fatal stab would have been a task made much easier to carry out, possibly. Because that's exactly how our military commits atrocities with ease. We have invented a reoccurring mechanism of dehumanization that simultaneously elevates whiteness while degrading the humanity of non-whites. Although it's difficult to pinpoint when exactly this got started within our deranged national history of genocide, slavery, and settler colonialism, it seems most natural to point to our first encounters with the Native Americans and that they were immediately portrayed as soulless inferior savages. Exterminating them was no doubt made an easier task by not regarding them as completely human, incapable of self-governance, and heathens. So too has white supremacy ascribed these false notions into the personhood of black and brown people beyond our national borders. These messages are reinforced by ideological state apparatuses, such as the cinema industry, educational curricula, and to a certain extent language itself. Our military-industrial complex functions as an efficient mechanism of death precisely because of the dehumanization of black, brown, and indigenous people brought about in the psyches of our soldiers by instruments of white supremacy. This dehumanization comports with their military training, educations received through public schooling, and social reinforcements. The other thing I took from the story of Abraham is the suspension of ethics Abraham must undergo to complete the task God himself has asked him to complete. Are we too, as a nation, suspending our own ethics to accomplish the task of spreading liberal democracy across the globe? Is the price of beautiful brown babies disintegrated by blasts of bombs a price not too high for us to carry forth the perceived will of God? Do our purported divine prerogatives supersede our sense of morality, in that it is morally wrong by any moral standard to kill? How do we then reconcile the bloodthirsty defense contractors inventing ever more efficient weaponry with the biblical teachings of Jesus? This is how American exceptionalism plays its role in our foreign policy. That this nation was ordained by divine providence, manifests by the will of God, and invokes God on our currency and in our pledge, it is assumed that God is on our side, just as the Crusaders believed God showed them favor, and the ISIS suicide bomber believes God is on his side as well. Given a divine hall pass for committing atrocities, and paired with a systematic dehumanization of non-white people, it is no wonder as to why or how the meat grinder continues churning. It is as if the meat grinder itself, in all its crushing of bone and flesh and spilling of blood, would not be permitted to exist and function without the electricity of religion, white supremacy, and dehumanization that powers it. At the end of the story of Abraham, after he is relieved of the task of executing his son, he sacrifices the sheep instead. He lays the sheep on the surface of where he previously laid his son, an area he prepared with kindling, and he sets the sheep aflame. He gives praise to God and is thankful that he and his son can return to their home, but it is easy to overlook how Abraham sacrifices the sheep without reservation. After all, a sheep is not a human being. A sheep is an animal, inferior to humans, to which God has, in the book of Genesis, given man dominion. Does this not relate to the way a Raytheon drone operator kills without moral considerations, or the way a police officer murders a black man with impunity during a routine traffic stop, or the way an American soldier in the South Pacific fetishizes women of Asian descent? The drone operator, the traffic cop, and the soldier all see their victims as less than human, as someone whose skin color is less than white, and in all cases, their victims are objectified. Now, I was not familiar with traditionalism until recently, so I'm going to assume you are not familiar with it either. Traditionalists are people who believe at one time, in the far distant past, there existed a true religion. Over time, this religion's doctrines and rituals have been fractured, splintered, and degraded. The best one could possibly hope for is to discover a sundered, fractioned, and bastardized piece of it. And this discovery might only be accomplished if one chooses a single religious tradition and devotes oneself to it entirely. They believe society only gets worse as time goes on, as every day we drift further from a holy path and teleology which is lost to us. Now, if all this sounds like it's a pessimistic and fatalistic worldview, that's because it is. If one were to take up these views, one would find the narrative of progress completely absurd, because in the mind of a traditionalist, things were in a state of perfection in the Garden of Eden, and since then, everything has basically been downhill. This is assuming, as a traditionalist, the religion you dedicated yourself to was Christianity, when it should be noted that traditionalists are largely fixated on Eastern religions, mainly Hinduism and Islam, as they are the oldest traditions with the most fully developed doctrine. In fact, the person the traditionalist school began with, a French author and intellectual named René Guénon, wrote with condescension and dismissiveness towards Christianity, Catholicism specifically, positing that Catholicism didn't really have a metaphysics and was too sentimental. This is not to say there are no Catholic traditionalists at all. Another French traditionalist writer, Jean Barella, wrote extensively in response to the critiques of Catholicism made by Guénon, and as you might imagine, Barella was a Catholic. There is a heavy dose of East versus West dichotomy built into traditionalism, with the West embodying all the elements philosophical, ideological, material, and cultural they oppose. In that traditionalists are opposed to modernity, it can be helpful to broadly label them as anti-Enlightenment thinkers. They are opposed to individualism, secularism, globalization, democracy, and liberalism. Now, some of the critiques of the aforementioned items that come out of the traditionalist thought are fascinating. Take, for example, democracy. Perhaps the most radical among us may believe that a dictatorship of the proletariat is more democratic than existing forms of capitalist democracy. Or maybe some of us feel the Constitution is wholly and completely illegitimate. Both of these people still believe in democracy, albeit in disparate forms, and both consider democracy, in general, to be a good thing. I don't know if many of us have someone in our lives who not only thinks democracy is bad, but loathes democracy as a primitive form of government. The reasoning is simple, and yet it's not that easy to argue against. If there were 10 cavemen in a cave, and 7 of them wanted to go outside the cave, it's easy to imagine the 7 of them making the other 3 oblige. It is in this way that a traditionalist would say that democracy implies force. I guess we could throw a monkey wrench into this thought experiment and propose the cavemen decide to stop venturing outside as a group, and instead each caveman decides when he or she wants to go outside individually. But the traditionalists would stop us and remind us they're also opposed to individualism. The traditionalist idealizes a time long before the philosophical rise of the subject, predating the discovery of the individual. They would point to the ways Greek tragedy was one of circumstance, whereas Western tragedy is a drama of the character. They would note the ways the style and development of Oedipus, compared with that of Shakespeare's Hamlet, Macbeth, and Othello, subjects of inner and relational turmoil, versus the subjects of destiny and cosmic irony. They would blame the turn to individualism, and ultimately liberalism itself, for creating a divide between normal life and religious life, and long for the olden days, the very, very olden days, when there was simply life and all of it was theological. They would also claim that this type of separation of normal and religious life has proved impossible, with the sacred migrating to new secular items, becoming the temples of liberal worship. The groundwork of new mythologies having been laid, ideologies then became new doctrines with new rituals and new dogmas and new answers to the perennial problems of life. Instead of looking to the divine for truths about the universe, science has been ordained as a guide to the truth. According to Daniel Schwindt, in his book, The Case Against the Modern World, A Crash Course in Traditionalism, quote, "No age before our own looked forward to the golden age and backwards to a dark age. Every people previous to us looked back to Eden and forward to the apocalypse. The golden age was the first and the dark age was the last. In this sense, we represent the reversal of all traditional wisdom regarding historical development. And so, whatever the cause that led to this reversal, we now firmly accept the myths of science and history, which is to say, materialism and progress. There can only be a migration of the sacred, never an elimination of it. And for us, the sacred has migrated to these material myths, and these are further interpreted within the framework of progress, a view of history that promises a future utopia if we only keep treading blindly forward. Because in a pure materialism, more is always better. To the traditionalists, liberalism is seen as a universalizing force spreading itself through all areas of thought, not limiting itself to the political realm. The effect liberalism has had on religion was to individualize religion in the form of the Reformation. Capitalism is the liberalism economics of unrestrained individualism, and free speech, absolute rights, and secularism are the individualized politics of liberalism. You can liken liberalism in this sense to the capitalist realism of Mark Fisher, in that every thought, motivation, and desire we feel in this sense contains within it a presupposition of capitalism. To the degree that capitalism and individualism are expressions of liberalism, you can start to paint a picture of exactly why traditionalists have such a scorn for modernity and the West and harbor a deep wanting to return to a pre-Enlightenment way of being. So there doesn't seem to be much room for the political realm within the views of traditionalism. Why bother attempting to exert political power if society can only get worse as time marches forward? It doesn't seem like there would be much interest there in policies like Medicare for All or emancipation campaigns. They don't have an interest in maintaining modernity because they don't see anything good in modernity to maintain. It should go without saying that these people hate America, because America to them is an abomination. It was born out of modernity with the values of the Enlightenment, and so it's entirely incongruent within the traditionalist overarching ideology. The fatalism of their perspectives harbor a certain anti-solutionism, in that believing we can solve and any attempts to solve the problems of modernity are also a problem in modernity. This speaks to the air of divestment regarding any hope for the future, and the disavowing of any obligation to participate in the creation of a better society that is consistent with their worldviews. René Guénon once wrote, "The malaise of the modern world lies in its relentless denial of the metaphysical realm." Liberalism can be seen, then, from the perspective of a traditionalist, as the absence of metaphysics. Given that spirituality is not given a primacy within modernity, the micropolitical is the logic of a society which gives a primacy instead to the realm of the political. But even this can be seen as part of the ultimate atomization that comes with hyper-individualism. The traditionalists resent the way modernity, liberalism, has centered man as the origin of morality, because that makes the external moral imperative that tethered man's actions to a standard outside of himself, giving him an external and objective aim, disappear. Without that external standard, man may be free, but they are free in the sense of being liberated from your own atmosphere. You have become an autonomous source and measure of the good, and you may go any direction you like. But in an infinite vacuum, you can go anywhere, but there is nowhere to go, and so you are not actually free. Imagine you are sitting in a Starbucks when a young girl walks in and orders an iced coffee. You take notice of her. The Apple wireless earbud she has in one ear while she holds the other, the yoga pants and the athletic shoes she's wearing, the faint sweat on the back of her neck indicating she must have come from a workout. Her shirt says the word Namaste in a whimsical font. And now that she has received her iced coffee, she places her left earbud she was holding in her hand back in her ear, and she proceeds to exit the coffee shop. This person could be quite a few of us. I would imagine the person I've described cares about the environment, tries to eat healthy, and prefers produce from the organic section. This person is on board with not using plastic straws and might own a hybrid vehicle, as they're not only concerned with limiting their own carbon footprint, but purchasing their car was a part of a larger consideration of not wishing to fund giant oil companies that do damage to the earth. This is all to say that the micropolitical plays an important role in this person's life. Whereas this person has come to meet the expectations of liberal society, and that they are politically informed and a well-adjusted member of their community, this person is unlikely to adhere to existing religious traditions. On the contrary, most churches are losing members just as fast as people are breaking with the traditions of their youth. I doubt this person would say they are bereft of any spirituality at all, though. After all, her shirt says Namaste. And while the meaning of the word translates literally to bow to you, in Hinduism the term means the sacred in me recognizes the sacred in you. This notion of being spiritual but not religious seems to have permeated liberal society, and consequently, those not adhering to any one specific religion have become modern-day religious syncretists. What other term would you use to describe folks that take a bit of the act of praying out of the Abrahamic religions, the yoga and mindfulness out of the Hindu traditions, the interconnectedness of an oversoul from Emerson and Thoreau? And perhaps they think of the tumult one naturally encounters in life as karma. Maybe this person has gone as far as to adopt the perspectives of Buddhism and regards life itself as suffering. Or perhaps this person practices Stoicism. Maybe they believe in reincarnation. Honestly, every spiritual but not religious person has some combination of these things I've listed, and they've synergized these various elements into their own personal, individualized faith. The aspect most of them hold in common is that at the core of their practice, and perhaps more broadly they may feel the purpose of their existence, is to become their most authentic self. Life within the container of the human subject, the sole arbiter of the good, absent of any external standard or objective aim, leads them to a philosophical outlook in service of refining their own sense of self. It is in this way that modernity is seen as an obstacle to discovering the more authentic self. The requirements of society for you to exist within it, the menial factory job or time required inside of an office, the stress of meeting one's obligations, and the struggle to find idle time for one's own pursuits. All of this is regarded as an encumbrance towards the ultimate mission of becoming more of yourself. This isn't to posit the notion that being spiritual but not religious is anti-modern, as I don't think that's an entirely accurate description of the way they regard the world and society writ large. But it is to say, self-actualization, in the same way that it tops the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, gives an ideological capstone to their belief system. It's important to understand the concept of authenticity in this sense comes from German philosopher Martin Heidegger. In his seminal work, Being and Time, Heidegger writes about authenticity being a kind of shift in attention and engagement and a reclaiming of the self from the way we typically fall into our everyday ways of being. Though the larger project of Heidegger was to define, capital B, being, there are aspects of his work that have been absorbed into the New Age range of spiritual beliefs as they pertain to letting oneself be summoned out of one's lostness and carving out one's unique and authentic place and approach to the world, and doing this work with a special intent and self-knowledge. While Heidegger is argued by some scholars to be the most important thinker of the 20th century, and though both sides of the political spectrum engage and reference his work and concepts, it should come as no surprise that there are also anti-Heideggerians who would consider his work wholly and completely illegitimate on account of him joining the Nazi Party in 1933. Though he privately expressed regret for doing so, describing his political engagement as, quote, the greatest stupidity of his life, many notable philosophers uphold his work, asserting that his work in philosophy should be jettisoned from his political activities. But it was in furthering his own investigation of Dasein, being there, and in a furtherance of his conceptual authenticity, that his questions of what is being shifted from a philosophical inquiry to a more overtly political line of questioning in who am I and who are we? However, and not that I am placing a prejudgment on this hypothetical woman inside of the coffee shop, it is in my estimation that most individuals who use the word authenticity in this context are ignorant of the Heideggerian philosophical underpinnings. I would not expect the woman in the coffee shop to know this any more than I would expect the average person buying organic produce to know the inventor of organic food was Rudolph Steiner, an Austrian-born philosopher, esotericist, and claimed clairvoyant. Though in his day Steiner spoke out about anti-Semitism and the National Socialist Party, and was the subject of press attacks mounted by Adolf Hitler and other right-wing nationalists, Steiner himself did promulgate the idea that Jewish cultural and social life had lost all contemporary relevance and promoted full assimilation into the nations where they lived. The Heideggerian context of authenticity, as well as the origins of organic food, are as unnoticed as the introductory points of Hinduist concepts into the American vernacular. How Americans came to find meditation, karma, reincarnation, and yoga commonplace is not common knowledge. Likewise, I would not expect the spiritual but not religious to understand why Umberto Eco, in his 1993 essay, listed syncretism and calls out the shelves labeled New Age in American bookstores as the very first item characterizing an ur-fascism, or an eternal fascism. The second item on Eco's list is traditionalism. Another key contributor to traditionalist thought is the Italian writer Julius Evola. He has been described as a fascist intellectual, a radical traditionalist, anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, and anti-popular, and as having been the leading philosopher of Europe's neo-fascist movement. He was also an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, an esotericist, and occultist. Over the course of his life, he wrote at least 36 books and over 1,100 articles. He was little known outside Italy, Germany, and France until his works began to be published in English in 1990. At one point, Evola called Italy's fascist movement a, quote, laughable revolution. He saw Mussolini's fascist party as possessing no cultural or spiritual foundation, and he was passionate about infusing it with these elements to make it suitable for his ideal conception of Übermensch culture, characterized by the imperial grandeur of pre-Christian Europe. Mussolini read Evola's Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race in 1941, and went as far as to meet with Evola and offer him praise. Evola would later recount that Mussolini had found in his work a uniquely Roman form of fascist racism distinct from Nazi Germany. After the Lateran Treaty was signed, settling the political status of Vatican City, Evola's anti-Catholicism was strategically less valuable to Italy's fascist regime, so he tried to align himself in his beliefs with Nazi Germany. The SS quickly determined that Evola was a, quote, reactionary Roman, and they concluded he was proposing a revolt of the old aristocracy against today's world, promoting an old-fashioned aristocratic feudalism. Heinrich Himmler signed a memorandum stating the recommendations that support for his efforts be withheld, his activities in Germany be curbed as to prevent further penetration into the party, and his activities in other countries should be observed. I want to give a special thanks to historian Robert Tobin for some of this information, as he wrote an excellent paper about the life and work of Julius Evola, called The Evolian Imagination: Gender, Race, and Class from Fascism to the New Right. I'll leave a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to read about the guy the Nazis rejected for being too radical. In 1951, he was arrested and charged with promoting the revival of the Fascist Party and of glorifying fascism. And at his trial, he declared that he was not a fascist, but instead was a super-fascist. He was acquitted. According to Paul Furlong's book, Social and Political Thought of Julius Evola, I'm going to quote extensively from it here. In general, he thought his audience comprised the limited number of men in the modern world who had the personal qualities to resist modernity in the name of tradition. For them, he sought to analyze and explain how they could resist, what interior and exterior strategies they should adopt. Evola believed in the existence of an absolute being, existing in stillness and power in a higher eternal spiritual realm, and that all other beings are no more than imperfect expressions of the single absolute. These ideas were part of the common heritage of humanity, and therefore his principles are a universal and eternal philosophy. He believed deeply that the higher spiritual realm determined the lower material world, and therefore it should be expected that those who were spiritually superior should be in some sense physically superior also, precisely because of their moral qualities. Wisdom is the process of the individual human being towards initiation, towards the absolute being. Wisdom is not a matter of knowing something. Truth is not achieved through scientific experiment or common sense experience, but through the exercise of spiritual discipline. Initiation, or gnosis, is the process by which the individual becomes more of a person, more of themselves, more differentiated, and achieves increasing control of their entire being as wisdom is enhanced. Tradition is then not the product of mere cultural nostalgia or a belief in a historical golden age. It is an eternal form of supernatural knowledge, and therefore a superior form of being. Tradition, therefore, has as its central values authority, hierarchy, order, discipline, and obedience. These are not historically conditioned. They are absolute and eternal. History is the unfolding in time and space of the cyclical struggle between tradition and the forces of disorder, disintegration, contingency, and lack of differentiation, which are inherent in the process of becoming. Modernity is the culmination of the temporary success of the forces of disorder, the age of darkness, a prelude to the return to the golden age and the reemergence of the forces of tradition. End quote. So maybe the term spiritual racism is an accurate shorthand for some of the beliefs espoused by Evola. What was initially appealing to Mussolini about Evola's writings was the way his racism and anti-Semitism anchored itself on the immateriality of the soul rather than biological features. Evola found the, quote, Jewish soul to be a much more pernicious problem than biological Judaism, going as far as to say that those who appeared physically Aryan, quote, could be Jewish in soul and life. And Mussolini endorsed this view because it ultimately gave him the power to decide who was racially inferior while holding at bay the German racial theorists who were not always flattering to Italians. Aside from these horrifically bigoted notions mixed with a bit of spirituality, I think it's important to understand Evola from a position of hierarchy. So much of the Marxist, anarchist, and critical theory schools of thought are about calling into question and ultimately breaking down hierarchies. Evola is unique in that he seems to be picking up on some thoughts that first came from Aristotle, and that Aristotle formed his biological taxonomy by observing and documenting as many animals as he could. He also did something similar with types of governments to form a political taxonomy. He later employed his political taxonomy to justify the exclusion of certain people from civic life. Aristotle argued that some people, by nature, rather than circumstances, are fit to be slaves, and he wrote that, quote, slavery is both expedient and right. He also wrote, quote, for some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Now, I'm sure listeners can make connections between Aristotelian and Evolian thought here. But plainly stated, if nature, including hierarchies and natural slavery, is simply a fact, then society can function properly only if it is ordered with this fact in mind. The type of society Aristotle envisioned was a hierarchical society, where everyone had their proper place, from fully enfranchised citizens all the way down to slaves, whereas Evola envisioned the same, but his was more of a caste system with priests at the top, followed by a warrior class, then by merchants, and finally slaves at the bottom. So as you can tell, Julius Evola was a real piece of shit. And in conducting the research for this episode, as surprising as this may sound, and as unsettling as his beliefs and his writings are, he was not the worst character I discovered. That award for the biggest piece of shit I've learned about during my research goes to a woman named Maximiani Julia Portas, who is better known as Savitri Devi. Like Evola, she was also a follower of Hinduism and a believer in the Yuga cycle. Within the Hindu tradition, there is a notion of time being cyclical, with the Golden Age happening first, proceeding to the last cycle, the Dark Age, known as the Kali Yuga. Hindus believe that human civilization degrades spiritually during this final cycle, and rulers no longer take it as their duty to promote spirituality. Society degrades into widespread avarice, with humans openly displaying animosity to each other. Religion, truthfulness, cleanliness, tolerance, mercy, physical strength, and memory diminish with each passing day. People will have thoughts of murder with no justification and will see nothing wrong in that. Lust will be viewed as socially acceptable, and sexual intercourse will be seen as a central requirement of life. Sin will increase exponentially, while virtue will fade and cease to flourish. People will become addicted to intoxicating drinks and drugs. Gurus will no longer be respected, and their students will attempt to injure them. Earthquakes will be common. Weather and environment will degrade with time, and frequently unpredictable rainfalls will happen. The powerful people will dominate the poor people. Many diseases will spread. Fake ideologies will spread. And all the human beings will declare themselves as gods, or boon themselves as gods, and make it as a business instead of teachings. At the end of the Kali Yuga, Lord Vishnu will take birth on earth to wipe out the sinners. It is mentioned that Lord Vishnu's avatar will come to earth on a white horse with wings. Now, Savitri Devi was a devout follower of Adolf Hitler. Born in France in 1905, she traveled to India in 1932 in search of a living pagan Aryan culture, believing India to represent the, quote, best of racial segregation. She lauded the Indian caste system, regarding it as the archetype of racial laws intended to govern the segregation of different races and to maintain the pure blood of the fair-complexioned Aryans. She took the name Savitri Devi when she formally adhered to Hinduism, and she became a proponent of Hindu nationalism. It's difficult to say whether Devi was familiar with the writings of Evola or Bannon, but one imagines she had engaged with their writings at some point, since by the time she moved to India, Evola had already written around 7 books and Bannon had written at least 12. Throughout Evola's work, he returns frequently to the concept of Hyperboreans, which in Greek mythology, those were an ancient people who lived in the far northern part of the known world. To Julius Evola and René Guénon, the Hyperboreans were folded into the overall myth of an Indo-European Aryan race, with Hyperborea as the center of civilization and spirituality during the Golden Age. To Evola and Guénon, mankind does not rise from the ape, but progressively devolves into an ape-like condition as it strays physically and spiritually from its mystical, otherworldly homeland in the far north, succumbing to the demonic energies of the South Pole. These are some strange ideas, to say the least. I mean, we've got cyclical time, elements of Hindu eschatology, ancient civilizations living near the North Pole, and these ideas are being forwarded by racist and spiritual fascists. It causes one to wonder, were characters like Guénon and Evola using esotericism as a blanket cover for larger racist ideas? From Evola's ideas of Hyperboreans came the writings of Robert True, one of the first theorizers of ancient astronauts. True further infused racism into these ideas as he placed Hyperborea between Iceland and Greenland and made it the home of a Nordic white race with blonde hair and blue eyes. He also claimed this race was extraterrestrial in origin, and these ideas have spread to ufology, where these humanoid extraterrestrials who resemble Nordic Scandinavians are known as Pleiadians. All of these ideas were influences on the greater emerging concept we're speaking to, which is esoteric Nazism. And the mother of all of this is said to be Savitri Devi. Searching for a living pagan Aryan culture in India, she attempted to merge Hinduism with Hitlerism, believing that Hitler was the avatar of Lord Vishnu in the Kali Yuga. She called him the godlike individual of our times, the man against time, the greatest European of all times, having an ideal vision of returning his Aryan people to an earlier, more perfect time, and having the practical wherewithal to fight the destructive forces in time. She saw his defeat as a result of him being, quote, too magnanimous, too trusting, too good, of not being merciless enough, or having in his psychological makeup too much sun and not enough lightning. Now, it's important to understand that leading up to World War II, it was not uncommon to see pictures of Hitler among candles and sacred objects in the shrines of people's homes in India. Hitler was, after all, the enemy of their enemy, British colonial forces currently occupying India. All that stopped, though, after folks received word of the death camps. But for Savitri Devi, that was when she finally traveled to Germany. She was arrested for passing out several thousand handwritten leaflets encouraging, quote, men and women of Germany to hold fast to our glorious National Socialist faith. She served 8 months in prison, where she wrote more Nazi bullshit and befriended some Nazis who were in prison with her. In addition to writing several books that have influenced Nazi occultism and esoteric Hitlerism, she also wrote a collection of devotional poems dedicated to Adolf Hitler, as well as a fictionalized autobiography of her favorite cats. Look, Savitri Devi was a fucking awful person, and I want to point you to a podcast called Behind the Bastards, who did an in-depth look at her life for listeners who want to learn more about her. But there's also a really great book by Nicolas Goodrick-Clark called Hitler's Priestess, Savitri Devi, the Hindu-Aryan Myth and Neo-Nazism, which I sourced extensively from. But obviously the reason why I'm telling you about her, and the reason I'm telling you about Julius Evola, is because I want to give you an analytical lens to look at the far right by dissecting the ideas of their influential thinkers. There is a company affiliated with white supremacist and neo-Nazi Richard Spencer that is publishing the works of Evola and Devi, even translating their untranslated works for publication. I think it's important for you to know about these people and their ideas, because these deranged fantasies and spiritual beliefs are at the core of the Eurasian nationalist movement, white nationalism, traditionalism, and the alt-right. And just as Savitri Devi and Julius Evola have had lasting impressions on white supremacist movements, so too has Savitri Devi had a lasting impression on animal rights, ecological, and New Age or New Thought movements. In her 1959 book titled The Impeachment of Man, she declared her views on animal rights and nature. According to her, human beings do not stand above the animals. Human beings are a part of the ecosystem and should respect all life, including animals and the whole of nature. She always held radical views on vegetarianism and supported the death penalty for those who did not respect nature or animals. Even for green thinkers not aware of Savitri Devi's ideas, American ecology movements bear an uneasy resemblance to her biocentric view. In his 1978 book, The Arrogance of Humanism, biocentrist David Ehrenfeld rejects the humanist foundation of modern life, denying that any part of nature has more value than another. Professors Bill Duvall and George Sessions have publicized biocentrism as a fundamentalist movement opposed to the pragmatic approach of reform ecology. In their influential book, Deep Ecology, man is regarded as a degenerate and artificial creature in painful opposition to wild, untamed nature. Only a radical reevaluation of human importance can avert the grim future of a teeming, polluted planet. Man must give up his privileged position as the lord of the earth and seek a new accommodation with nature, at once harmonious, modest, and subordinate. At the core of deep ecology is the work of English economist Thomas Malthus, who first posited that species proliferate until they exhaust their food source in his 1978 work on the principle of population. An extreme school of ecological catastrophism regards all human civilization as deleterious and evil. Such anti-humanist sentiment, coupled with the idealization of animals and nature, represent a break with liberal thought. Many radical ecologists believe that human population must be drastically reduced because humans have simply become too numerous, placing an intolerable burden upon their natural environment. The sources in deep ecology are sought in mysticism, Christianity, Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Native American spirituality. The authors of deep ecology also trace their ideas to the literary ideas in the literary tradition of naturalism and pastoralism in America, such as Henry Thoreau, John Muir, Robinson Jeffers, and Walt Whitman. The right-wing organization of Noontide Press in California has recognized this receptivity to the Nazi religion of nature by bringing out a new edition of Savitri Devi's Impeachment of Man. Presented by the publisher as an indictment of the values and mores of our modern human-centered produce and consume society, the book attempts to popularize her conviction that divinity manifests itself in all of nature, that man is nothing special, and that his recent ideas of universal equality and entitlement to prosperity at the expense of the rest of nature are fundamentally wrong. The beautiful tiger, the great banyan tree, the lithe felines. According to Savitri Devi, these are noble creatures, but not all, quote, two-legged mammals qualify. Only the strong, intelligent Aryan is fit to survive in a redeemed biocentric order. The publisher's foreword gives a brief account of her life, mentioning her lifelong devotion to Nazism and her book in which she, quote, portrayed Hitler and National Socialism as expressions of transcendent spiritual truth. Such an edition is a telling example of the new entryism the far right is currently pursuing in its appeal to green and new age audiences. Deep ecology, biocentrism, nature worship, and new age paganism reflect a hostility towards Christianity, rationalism, and liberalism in modern society. Their increased tendency towards myth and despair indicate their susceptibility to the mythical ideas of the far right. Neo-Nazi and fascist activists now actively seek to infiltrate the ecological and esoteric scene by way of Evolian and Devian inroads. The misanthropy of Devi, the mysticism of Evola, the pessimism of the Kali Yuga, and the visions of Julius, Evola, and Savitri Devi for a pristine Aryan order possess a perennial appeal in times of uncertainty and change. But by blaming humanity collectively for an ecological disaster, there is a deflection of any critique of capitalism and authority, thereby frustrating genuine social emancipation. Marxist ecologists regard such doctrine as the ideological ally of monopoly capitalism. By rejecting man's claim to distinctiveness from animals and plants, biocentrism reduces mankind to a mere biomass, a burden on nature. Only by denying the special status of man can capitalism soften up democracy to accept the mass dying of third world populations, as well as the euthanasia of the elderly, ill, poor, and redundant in the rich global north. The larger picture emerging from the legacies of Savitri Devi and Julius Evola are the rejections of those ideas of modernism, like revolution, democracy, equality, liberalism, scientism, in favor of spirituality, hierarchy, organicism, and monarchy. So I want to go back to around the place where we started. I was telling you about my family and how they're Catholic on my mom's side and they're Protestant on my dad's side, and I got the worst of both of those worlds growing up. But with the years gone by, my grandmother's request for me to be involved with the church slowly eroded into what they are now, which is my mother asking me to think a few thoughts in the direction of any god from time to time. I thought, perhaps, with society having adopted a different set of cultural practices surrounding religion, that my mother's request to pray, or her request for me to find some semblance of spirituality, had just shifted with the times. But the whole God can be anything thing, like God can be the ocean, God can be a tree, as if to say, hey, we know you're not going to become a Christian, but maybe we can settle for some light pantheism, maybe a drop or two of animism. I'll tell you what though, telling someone that God is a flower in the crack of a sidewalk, or that God is a tree in Central Park, all that sounds much cooler in the abstract. All this sounds much cooler when it's something that stays in the air, instead of materializing into a practice, a following, or anything more than an aphorism. To think of a person literally worshiping a flower in a sidewalk or a tree along a hiking trail, it's absurd on its face, but anyone who feels especially at home out in the woods would probably not describe the feelings they have while in nature as, literal tree or flower worship. Maybe they'd say their appreciation for the earth and the natural beauty of the land provide them with a sense of spiritual fulfillment. So we're not talking about animism or the attribution of souls to plants so much as we might be speaking of a pantheism, which is a belief that the universe and all things within nature are God. Maybe there's a similar pattern to be correlated within the practices of yoga and mindfulness, in that practicing meditation and thought observation combined with a physical routine of yoga, can have a role in a spiritual process in addition to any of the reasons one decides to take up these practices. In the same way that one might think of a hiking trail in nature as their church, so too might a person consider yoga or meditation as their version of church, in that both would probably find a center of peace and tranquility through engagement in these pastimes. Perhaps the person who enjoys the outdoors may say something to the effect of communing with nature is vital for their soul, or the person who does yoga in the morning may say her routine enables her to be kinder and more patient in a stressful work environment. For whatever the reason, sometimes the hobbies or pastimes we most enjoy and have fond memories of offer us a form of spiritual nourishment. But let's say we took this appreciation for nature and we try to give it extension, shape, and a form in reality. Maybe this would lead to, the attribution of souls to plants. Maybe it would include believing that all plants are God. Maybe nature is God and we ought to be more respectful to nature and our role embedded within it. Anyway, I trust you can see where this line of thought might head. If it doesn't lead into something resembling pre-Christian paganism, it might lead into forms of biocentrism, perhaps a regard for humans and nature to be co-equals, and ultimately a desire to achieve that state of equilibrium by way of squashing human exceptionalism. These are other forms of slippery slopes that I've made mention of earlier, only instead of sliding one from non-spirituality into a vague sense of theism, these slippery slopes take a vague sense of theism and slide them into world outlooks that are useful for germinating the seeds of fascism. It's in this way that the old adage of fire being a dangerous servant and a fearful master becomes relatable to the role spirituality has within society. If we are to accept spirituality as a part of the human condition, and perhaps go as far as to factor in the human compulsion to worship as part of the nature of being human, then we must take seriously the cognitive workings of these compulsions to worship as they relate to inchoate forms of fascism, lest we allow spirituality to burn the whole house down. You could say that I'm presenting the point of view that we should treat religion as a dangerous servant, and you could argue that in my presenting of religion or spirituality as a dangerous servant, there is an air of contempt I'm showing towards spirituality. And I won't disagree with that sentiment because I think it's partially true. But I would say that I've been very honest about my feelings towards religion, and I've told you a great deal about my own history regarding spirituality. And in the end, this entire arch that the show is taking isn't about asking you to harbor any resentment or contempt towards spirituality, any more than you would show contempt or resentment towards fire. I mean, fire is a natural thing in the world. It helps us. It keeps us warm. It's a source of energy, and I doubt very much we would have survived or evolved to the point humanity is at without it. No one holds contempt for fire. If anything, we respect fire for what it is, and we understand fire itself is indifferent to what it burns. If anything, presenting the idea of spirituality relating to fire and it being a dangerous servant and a fearful master is a respectful positioning towards spirituality. I'm certainly not saying all of this to persuade anyone into practicing a spiritual abstinence, but I am attempting to encourage a practice of safe spirituality. I think it's perfectly fine if a person wishes to feel that nature has a certain enchantment, but those feelings of reverence towards nature can and have given way in some individuals to a certain type of biocentric anti-human misanthropy. The optimism so often found in spirituality is then negated by a profound pessimism, and I'm not even saying that it's bad or wrong to lead one's life with a primacy given to spirituality or religion. I am just saying that we must be aware and consider the way a primacy of the spiritual can harbor items conducive to fascism. Maybe the living example that proves this point is Alexander Dugin, a Russian political analyst and strategist known for his fascist views. He was the main organizer of the National Bolshevik and Eurasia Party, both far-right contemporary movements. Dugin is a traditionalist, and he did not have any public notoriety until he wrote a book called Foundations of Geopolitics, in which he called for a Tokyo-Moscow-Berlin alliance. This seminal work has been referred to as Russia's Manifest Destiny, in that Dugin lays out a theory of a Euro-Soviet empire in place of the existing Atlanticism or the European-US alliance. For as much of this as can be thought of purely in the realm of political or foreign policy or international relations or however you want to categorize the Eurasian nationalist movement, Dugin, being the orchestrator and theorist behind these movements, mirrors Julius Evola and his events to integrate spirituality into his brand of fascism. One of the reasons we must seriously consider the ways spirituality can posit items useful for inchoate fascism is because fascists use spirituality as inroads to fascism, and that applies to people of any political or spiritual persuasion. We've gone over the ways Julius Evola tried to infuse the fascist movements of his time with traditionalism, and we are now living in a world where traditionalism has made its way into the halls of power, not only in Russia with Alexander Dugin, but in Brazil with Olavo del Carvalho, and in the United States with Steve Bannon. To the degree that spirituality has always been a dangerous servant, traditionalists would have spirituality become the fearful master that would burn modernity to the ground. All right, so thank you for listening to this episode. I so appreciate you taking the time to entertain some of these ideas, and so now I would like to invite you to listen to further episodes that expound upon some of the thinkers I've mentioned in this episode. So if you want to learn more about the far right, traditionalism, and the way all of this relates to contemporary geopolitics, episode 30 features an interview with Benjamin Teitelbaum, the author of War for Eternity. Professor Teitelbaum has spent numerous hours interviewing some of the key players taking their influence from traditionalist thinkers, so he can offer a tremendous amount of insight into people like Olavo, Alexander Dugin, and Steve Bannon. If you want to learn more about Heidegger and the influence he's had on philosophy and what all we might salvage from his philosophy after joining the Nazi Party in 1933, episode 31 will be out at midnight on Sunday, May 30th, 2021. And after all of that, we'll be releasing episode 32 featuring Matthew Lowry from the Acid Horizon podcast, which we love here on the No Easy Answers podcast. We'll be discussing another political philosopher who joined the Nazi Party, Carl Schwindt. And Schwindt is a controversial character, yet another controversial character, in that his critiques of liberalism are cited by both sides of the political aisle. And I think even if you identify as a liberal, you will want to listen to that episode, as Schmidt's work is no doubt one of the stronger critiques of liberalism. So you can sharpen your own ideological blade by understanding some of his arguments. So this is kind of like the start of a choose-your-own-adventure book. Turn to episode 32 if you want to hear more about Carl Schwindt. Turn to episode 31 if you want to learn more about Martin Heidegger. Turn to episode 30 if you want to learn more about how traditionalism has very real effects in geopolitics. And again, all of this is with the intention of examining the cognitive, psychological, and logical workings of the far right and those in society who would stand in the way of progress. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it has left you with some thoughts to chew on. Hit us up on Twitter at NoEasyAnswerPod, or on our Reddit page or Discord if you would like to join the conversation, offer some feedback, or just shoot the shit and say hello. Until next time, take care all my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. See ya.